when you're photographing tracks, such as this deer track, the idea is to get not only the track itself, but some of the context. So if you can pick out more than one track in a sequence, I would photograph the gait if you can see it. In this case, because of the substrate difficulty, there is no real gait picture here to take, so that's not going to be as helpful. But sometimes if you're out in sand, you can see quite a bit of the way the animal is moving. So to photograph this track properly, you want to hold your camera parallel to the ground. The cameras have an image sensor in them, and the image sensor is oriented in the direction that the screen is. Same is true for a DSLR. What you want to do is fill the frame with your image of your track, so that the track takes up as much of the space as possible. You can go really close or use your macro mode if it's a small track. But also, one thing to be aware of, especially with animals like deer, is this is not the complete track right here. Deer have dew claws, which are these two marks back here. Notice the parallel indentations that are part of this track. So if I was to properly photograph this track, I would include those dew claws. If you do it without the dew claws, you're going to get a limited picture of that track. Dew claws can help you tell front from hind on deer tracks, so it's important to try to photograph them as well if you're looking for an identification. To that end, it's best to photograph them in the landscape mode because it's a long track, and to get all the details in there, you want to fill your frame completely with that track. What I do usually is photograph the track first without a scale, and then I put the scale in there and take more photographs of it with the scale so that you can see how big it is. What that does is if this was in fine sand, it would be very easy to accidentally put your hand in it or drop something on it and ruin the details of that track. So this one's in mud. It's not much danger that I'm going to destroy anything by touching it or anything or dropping something on it. But just to be aware of that if you drop your ruler on a track in sand, you're probably going to ruin the details. So take a picture of it without the scale first. Then place your scale in there. If you don't have a scale, your hand does in a pinch. Stick your hand in there. You can go back later and photograph your hand with a ruler if you really are concerned about the scale. You could throw a penny down there, or car key, or something like that that provides scale. A car key is not ideal because it's not an object of known size. They vary in size. So pick something that everybody's going to recognize. Sometimes trackers are able to identify the leaves of various species of trees in photographs, and that helps with the scale a little bit, but leaves also vary in size. So they're not an ideal scale. The ideal scale is a little ruler or something of known size. An ink pen even works in a pinch. Some folks stick their foot in there, or just a hand. And anyway, put your scale in there, take a photo with the scale. You're going to want to take it straight up and down. So instead of an angle like this, if you take it at an angle, notice how those details are foreshortened and you're missing the dew claws. So if you take your photograph at an angle, that's artistic, but it's not very useful for identifying that track. You want to hold your camera straight up and down and look straight down on the track itself. Take your photo and then place your scale and then take another one. And then after that, you're going to want to get a picture of the entire gate so that you can show the whole scene. It's helpful for a tracker who is going to try to identify your footprint from your photo to have those different views, because the gait often helps you identify a species, especially when they're closely related or the tracks look a lot like each other. So if I wanted to zoom in really close on a tiny, tiny track or get some of the details of this track, I would use the macro mode on my camera. And usually that is the little icon on your camera will either be a microscope or it will be a flower icon. And what that shows you is that you can focus really close. Some cameras can focus as much as 1 centimeter from the lens. And that's the point and shoot cameras and your cell phone cameras. DSLRs, you're going to need to choose a lens that you can focus really close. So with a DSLR, you're going to need a macro lens specifically, and you will probably need a tripod because trying to hand-hold a macro photograph with a DSLR is next to impossible, even in good lighting conditions. Don't zoom in, because when you zoom in, that tends to make you lose details. When you're in macro mode, a lot of these little cameras will autofocus like that, but some cameras will not do that. The more you zoom in, the harder it is to hand hold a photo and not get a blurry shot because of the light and the amount of light that is reaching the image sensor in the camera. So it's best to try not to zoom in, not to use large zoom lenses on DSLRs to zoom in on tracks, because usually you'll get a blurry picture. You won't be happy with it unless you use a tripod. If you use a tripod, then you don't have that issue of the camera shake because of your hands and the variations that you can get there. Just like I was, if you're just hand holding it, it's going to be a shaky picture. When you zoom in, a lot of times the pictures on these little point and shoot cameras get pixelated because they're interpreting the photograph rather than using what's on the image sensor. It's digitally interpreting what's there. So you lose detail when you zoom in like that. Keep your zoom out at its widest and you'll get the best results. Make sure to fill your frame too. In this section, I'll show you some tips on how to photograph a sign that you find in the field that indicates the presence of wildlife. Anything that's not a track is a sign. It's basically a clue that an animal is present on that landscape, and any of the animal's activities can leave behind sign, such as scent marking or nest building, shedding, molting. All of those activities leave behind sign. In this section, I'll show you some tips on how to properly photograph the sign that you find in the field. When you're photographing an animal sign, such as these molehills, you want to give an overall view first. So take a picture showing the overall scene. You can also show the habitat in another photo, or try to get the molehills into the same picture that shows the habitat. What I like to do is take a picture from straight above and try to fill your frame with the entire molehill, and then put your scale in it. You can put it on top, but I don't like to interfere with the sign, the appearance of the overall animal sign. So fill your frame with your animal sign and place your scale in the picture. Some people use a hand as a scale. Sometimes a foot works if you don't have anything with you. When you're photographing larger scale animal signs, such as the remains of feeding signs here on these logs, first provide an overview. So take a photo that shows the logs where they sit in the forest, and then get closer and take an overall shot that shows the acorns as they are resting on the log, on the stump, and also on the log here. And then you can get closer. That's a pileated woodpecker in the background. So when you get closer, try to show just as they are, and before you place your ruler down, take a shot showing that, and then you can place your ruler to show the scale. And then after that, if you want to disturb them and pick them up, it's okay because you've taken a photo showing how it was set up when you found it. One reason to take the photos at the different scales like that and to show these in context is to help identify which animal left the sign. The survival strategy of a mouse is to take the acorns and take them under cover. So they'll go underneath the log or in these little nooks and crannies there and hide while they feed. Whereas the squirrel, the gray squirrel, will sit on top of a stump or on top of a log and feed on its acorns. So it has a way of looking around and surveying its surroundings for danger. So the survival strategy of the animal can be indicated in your photos of the track and sign by showing the overall view and then zooming in closer to look at the actual sign itself. And then for your final photo showing this sign, you want to get close up. Use your macro mode if you have it on your camera. It's usually indicated by a little flower icon. And using the macro mode, get close up to the sign and try to focus on the details that tell you which animal did this. So the edges may show some incisor marks, like this, or over here, This one shows what I believe is a beak mark, when the beak pecked at this acorn to open it, because birds will also do this. So show your sign up close so that you can tell which animal opened those particular acorns. Because several animals use logs like this, you want to make sure that you're photographing all the different ones in your documentation. So remember those survival strategies when you're photographing the sign of different species. Mice take things under logs where they're sheltered, and they feed on acorns underneath. So get some photos showing the acorns on site where they were found, and then you can pick them out and take close-up photos to show the sign on them. Use your macro lens to photograph the fine edge and the chatter that's there, which is the teeth marks left by the mice. Those little tiny marks are called chatter. So that's an identifying clue. So when you make your photographs, make sure to get that included, as well as the habitat where you saw or found these acorns in the first place. When you're photographing something like an antler rub on a sapling, it's good to get a photo from far back so that you can see the entire scene. You can see the tree, you can see the broken branches, and these details that won't be shown in a close-up. Now, one thing you run into when you use a little point-and-shoot camera to try and photograph the narrow trunk of a tree like this is focus is an issue. So the lens has a hard time interpreting what to focus on here. So it's helpful if you place your hand or a ruler or something behind it so that the camera can actually focus on the sign. And then, of course, hold it this direction so that you can take the photo. I can't do it because I'm videoing, but you want to show the entire sign, and you need to get your lens to focus on it. So it's easier with a DSLR because you can focus on a particular point. But with a point-and-shoot camera, you can't do that. And notice how the camera's lost focus here because it's interpreting the background as what I want to focus on. But it's not. So it helps to block the lens a little bit and to focus right on what you want to see with your camera. Here's another interesting situation. So when you're trying to photograph sign on a tree, such as the scratch marks from a bear, or in this case where a squirrel gathered nest material, you want to show how high up the tree this sign is, because obviously it's not going to be an antler rub if it's 5-6 feet up the tree where it begins. So the other thing is to show the context down here. Take a picture to show that there is some dropped material. Some of the bits of bark that were peeled off were dropped. Take a picture of that. Take an overall picture from standing way back so you can see the entire tree. And then get closer and show the details that tell you this was a squirrel rather than a bear, and that it wasn't an antler rub. You can also include your scale, again, because a tree trunk is going to give you the difficulty of the autofocus not focusing on it. So put your scale in there to help give your camera lens something to focus upon. You can also use a DSLR and get an overall view of it. The difficulty with DSLR is you have to make sure that your lens is capable of focusing as close as you need to be to see that sign. So here again, you can take a context photo, place the camera in the landscape mode, portrait mode, and take a context photo showing the entire tree and the background of the forest so you can see the environment in that picture also. And that helps give context so that a tracker can interpret what animal made that sign from your photos. When you find feathers, it's best to photograph them right where you found them. It's illegal to keep and collect the feathers of wild migratory birds, so it's best just to leave them. I usually remove debris from the photo so I can see the details of the feather. And first I photograph it exactly where I found it. Place your scale next to it. You can use centimeters or inches, depending on your preference, but put your scale next to it. Try not to cover up any of the details of the feather with your scale. And usually I will flip it over and get the back side of the feather also, because sometimes that's useful. Some feathers have tegmen which is a shiny area that's on the back. So photograph your feather, and then it's best to leave it. Get some photos from different angles if you want. Some folks like to pick them up and try to get pictures like that. If you're having trouble with your camera focusing on it because of the background, you could put it on a different color background, like stick it on your ruler, put it on your backpack, and photograph it with a lighter color background if that helps any of the details of the feather come out. But it's always best to leave these in the field, and once you got your good photographs of it, you really don't need to collect it anyway. You've got photos. So there's how to photograph a feather. One thing I wanted to mention is your photographic scale should be a photo-neutral gray color, which these are. Most of the forensic scales that are sold, you can get them in a variety of colors. The best color to use is this photo-neutral gray. And the reason for that is it affects the white balance of your camera. Most point-and-shoot cameras have an automatic white balance feature, and also DSLRs have that feature as well. But I have noticed that the colors, especially of a feather where color can be a key to identifying it, the colors can get a little bit off if you're not careful. So usually what I do is I photograph it first without the scale so that I get just the color as it is. I want to get all the details in here. And then I'll put the scale in there, which may slightly change the white balance of the photo and thus affect the color of the feather and affect, whether you can identify it correctly or not. So that's a reason for taking several shots with and without your scale in the image when you're photographing feathers. When photographing a scat, the same principles apply as when you're photographing a track. Remove all bits of debris like leaves and things that are in the way of your scat that you want to photograph. Try to get the entire thing in the frame of your photo, including all little pieces that might have fallen off. Photograph it from straight above at an angle that's parallel to the ground surface. Put your scale in there, somewhere where it's not in the way of the scat that you're photographing. Take a picture with and without the scale so that you don't affect the white balance. And then zoom in. I know this is an old scat, but sometimes it's helpful to zoom in on the scat and look at the contents, because that can help you differentiate carnivore scats from herbivore scats. There's bones in them sometimes. This is where your macro mode on your camera can be very useful in trying to see the small details of bones or scales or fur, skulls, whatever there may be in that scat that you're trying to show. So sometimes it's useful to interpret what the prey animals were so you can tell which predator was feeding upon them. Usually I take pictures of the scat intact first and make sure I get the entire appearance of it before I break it apart to look at the contents inside. So make sure you photograph all the bones and everything that you can see on site before you do any disturbance of it, because once you've broken it apart, you don't have that same appearance of it anymore. Once you're satisfied that you got enough photos of the scat, then you can break it apart and look at the contents. And I usually use a stick to do that, or you want to use gloves. You don't want to go handling it with your hands. Some folks roll them with their feet to break them open and see what's in them. This also gives you a chance to get the firmness test done to see if the scat is super firm, as in felines, or not firm, as in canines. So break it apart if you can. Sometimes they're just really difficult, like this one, because of the tightly packed fur. That's why I suspect this is an old bobcat scat that's been rained on, because it is difficult to break apart. Could be a canine. It's not super hard to break apart. But try to open it up, see if there are bones in it that you can identify, that will help you identify the prey animal that was eaten, and get photographs of those if you are able to separate them enough that you can actually identify the bones or the skull that's in there. So break it apart, look at the contents. In herbivores, you want to see what kind of seeds they were eating or what kind of vegetable material they were eating, and then use your macro lens to get close-ups of those items that are inside of it, so you can identify the diet of the animal that made your scat. So scats you document with a few photographs, because usually one is good to identify it, but if you want to see what was in it and identify all the different things it ate, which is really the fun part of studying these, then you'll want to get several photographs, perhaps from different angles, so you can determine what exactly this animal has been eating. And that tells you a lot about the biology of the species, and it helps the tracker to identify the scat from your photographs. For items that are of interest, like these claws right here, I like to photograph them against a plain background. In the field, the easiest way to do it is pick it up and put it on a leaf. Of course, I don't want to pick it up with my hands, because I don't have gloves, but you can use a stick or something to pick it up and place it on a leaf.